Now let's look in more detail at some points of internal consistency, that is, how the different New Testament documents confirm themselves and each other. One factor supporting the idea that the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts is that the way specific names are used in certain places. Most of the people mentioned in the Gospel are anonymous, outside Jesus and his inner circle of disciples, and public figures such as Herod and Pilate. For example, in Luke, there are about 50 secondary figures mentioned in the stories about Jesus whose names are not recorded. People met Jesus once, or people Jesus healed, and so on. But a few people in the Gospels are named, a few secondary figures. At first glance, it seems a bit random. Why are these particular minor characters named in the story? Scholar Richard Bauckham has suggested that it's because these people were eyewitnesses who were known in the later church and who would often share their stories to which their names were attached. So this was a way of citing the eyewitness sources of certain events back in the day before they had footnotes and bibliographies and things like that. For example, in Mark chapter 15, the author mentions the Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, and he was forced to carry Jesus' cross. Who are Alexander and Rufus? None of these people are ever mentioned again, and Matthew and Luke do not record their names, as you can see here. It makes sense that Alexander and Rufus were Christians living in Rome, so that when Mark was taking notes from Peter and compiling his gospel, he included their names because his audience all knew them. But when Matthew and Luke put together their final versions, they did not include those names because they were not well known to their audiences. But for Mark's audience, Mark was letting them know the connection between the story and someone they knew in that local area, so they could go talk to them and find out more details. Interestingly, there is a Rufus mentioned later living in Rome at the end of Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 13. It may or not be the same person, but it's interesting. Another example is Cleopas, or Clopas, who was one of the two disciples walking from Jerusalem back to Emmaus on the day that Jesus was resurrected. Luke mentions his name, and it seems kind of random because many other people in that story are not named, including the other disciple who was with Clopas. But Luke may have been showing that Cleopas was the source, the eyewitness who later told that story and was known for telling the story. Other examples of this phenomenon might include Jairus, Zacchaeus, Bartimaeus, Malchus, Joanna, people who they're kind of random names that are inserted here, but it makes sense if you understand that the audience would have known these people and would have known that they are the ones who were telling those stories. Another internal test is how we can compare different New Testament Gospels or other books against each other in a similar way as eyewitnesses are compared in court. If two accounts that claim to be based on eyewitness testimony are too similar to each other, that might indicate that they colluded together or copied from each other. If the accounts have major contradictions that are not reconcilable, then at least one must be mistaken and can't truly be an eyewitness account, and may be deceptive for presenting itself as eyewitness history. But if the accounts show some variations, but the variations, most of them, can be harmonized, then they still might be eyewitness accounts. And if the accounts show many examples of reconcilable variations, then it becomes very probable that they're based on accurate eyewitness accounts, just as in a courtroom situation. Here are some examples of variations between the Gospels which can be reconciled. The temple cleansings. Did Jesus do it early in his ministry, as recorded in John, or late in his ministry, as recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, or, as I think more likely, did he do it twice? Did Jesus carry his own cross to go out to the crucifixion site, or did Simon of Cyrene carry the cross? Or did he, as John says, go out carrying his own cross, and then on the way became too weak to carry it further after his night of abuse and beatings, and at that point they made Simon carry it, as the synoptics say. There's a couple places where Matthew mentioned that Jesus healed 2 demon-possessed men or 2 blind men, whereas another gospel only mentions 1. Is that a contradiction? Or could one of the gospels simply be spotlighting one of the people? Did the centurion personally come to Jesus to ask him to heal his servant, as Matthew seems to record in chapter 8? Or did he send a servant to make this request, as Luke records in chapter 7? Did Matthew condense the story into a simpler version? Or could both have happened? If the centurion started out sending friends, and then as Jesus approached the house, perhaps he sent more friends and then eventually came himself? Did Jairus tell Jesus My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so she will live, as recorded in Mark chapter 5. Or, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live, as recorded in Matthew 9. Or perhaps did he say both in his hurry of running and finding and asking Jesus to come? Luke says that Jairus began to implore him to come to the house, for he had an only daughter, and about 12 years old, and she was dying. So Jairus could have easily said both statements and a lot more besides, as he was running around trying to find Jesus, panicked, and Matthew and Mark summarized them. Of course, Jairus was probably speaking in Aramaic, and the Gospels were written in Greek, so there's obvious translation difference there as well. Did James and John ask Jesus for honors, as Mark 10 records? Or did their mother ask, as Matthew 20 records? Or, most likely, were all three of them there making the request, and the Gospel authors just chose to highlight different people? How many times was Jesus anointed with oil? When did it happen? 6 days before the Passover, as John seems to imply? Or 2 days before the Passover, as Mark seems to imply? See the supplement for a great resource examining this question. Did the Pharisees ask Jesus about the man with the withered hand, as Matthew seems to imply? Or did they stay silent, as Mark and Luke seem to imply? Or was there some of both of those things happening during the conversation? Was Jesus crucified on Friday, as the Synoptic Gospels imply, or Thursday, as a quick reading of John would imply? Of course, I think a more careful reading of John shows that he was also referring to Friday, the same day. Was the thief on the cross friendly to Jesus and believing in Jesus, as Luke implies? Or hostile and insulting Jesus, as Matthew and Mark implies? Or perhaps did one of the thieves start out angry and gradually have a change of heart as he observed Jesus over the hours? There are many reconcilable variations from Easter morning, which is exactly what we would expect if there were a lot of witnesses telling their stories of what happened that weekend. Just as, everybody has their story of where they were on 9/11. Think about all the disciples of Jesus, telling what happened to them that morning. How many women came to Jesus' tomb on Easter Sunday morning? When and where did Mary Magdalene first see the risen Jesus? Was Thomas present or not in the first appearance of Jesus to the group of male disciples? I'll stop here, but you can see there's obviously dozens and dozens of examples of apparent discrepancies, which some people would even label contradictions, although I think they can be reconciled. And I think these actually strengthen the case because they show that the gospel authors were not simply copying from each other. There are some eyewitness testimonies built in here that they're either interviewing or remembering in their own cases. And in Matthew's and John's case, they're remembering directly, perhaps.